From afar looking in, South Korea has achieved the impossible rebuilding of its economic status in a matter of decades since the war. But there are undeniable opportunity costs to rapid, intense growth. As I mentioned earlier, byproducts of a fierce competition at every level of academia and then the workforce, polarized society, and broken links in the social fabric we want to, well, maybe better fill. What are we missing? And most importantly, where do we go from here? We're joined by Korea Expose co-founder and freelance journalist based in Seoul, Rafael Rashid. He recently published a book on the topic of discussion, 우리가 보지 못한 대한민국. Good morning, Rafael.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us bright and early. Is there an English title to the book that you've recently published?
There's no actual official English title yet, but I'm trying to go with something along the lines of The Korea We Refuse to See.
The Korea We Refuse to See. That's much more active. The Korea We Refuse to See. Like any country, there are polarizations that are hard to deny. There's a divide that is more visible, it seems, each year. We talk about it more in the daily headlines. Specifically, we're going to focus on South Korea. First off, could you give our listeners a very brief introduction to your latest book and perhaps the inspirations that drove you to write?
Yeah, sure. So this book actually started off as a column that I was writing in El Korea about two and a half years ago. And it was a collection of just, I guess, everyday thoughts about Korean society. And I kind of decided to put them all together and try to come up with some common themes and eventually come up with this book. And of course, I've added a lot more to it. But overall, I think these columns and this book stem from just a simple question that I've always been kind of asking a lot of Koreans and a lot of friends around me, namely, are you happy? Are you guys happy? Because I know it's like a very simple question and maybe a bit cliche, but I've noticed, I've been here for over a decade, that a lot of the times there are things that people might be doing, but might not want to do. And I question if what they do and their actions, I wonder if it makes them happy. So I'm kind of just asking these simple questions. Going through 10 years in Korea, I studied here, went to university, went to a company here, and just going through different episodes, hopefully, a little bit funny episodes maybe, but some more serious episodes, trying to understand what makes people happy, something like that. So I've tried to put it all together in one book.
I think it's a fundamental question that I think the younger generation in South Korea always actually are more actively seeking answers to. I mean, there are more books on it, right? Seeking happiness, a more balanced life, quit your job if it makes you unhappy. I mean, these are not narratives that would have been common in the previous generations while South Korea's economy was growing at monumental rates. Times have changed. Growth might not necessarily be the only focus, dare I say, at the disinterest of all the major companies in South Korea. But I think by all measurable standards of wealth and living standards in South Korea, we're doing better than ever before in modern history. Yet, South Korea remains one of the unhappiest countries based on a number of different surveys. A UN Happiness Index, for example, there's an OECD equivalent of it. So based on your 10 years of working through some of the corporate machines and then having this freelancer perspective on what's happening here in Korea, why is this so? Why are we unhappy despite having made significant progress?
Of course, I'm sure there's people a lot more qualified than I who can answer that question. And also, there are so many factors, and I don't think we can talk about one individual factor. But just, I guess, for me personally, like I alluded to just a few minutes ago, I think in South Korean society, there is a lot of pressure, say, to conform or do things that you might not necessarily want to do, but are expected of you. And then there's the inner self, what you really want to do and what you really think, but might not be able to do it or might not be able to express it. And
Mm.
I guess for me personally, I think there is this conflict between the two, and this maybe inner conflict, I think, tears people apart and
Mm.
leads to some form of unhappiness.
It's almost a big divide, a gap between your reality and your ideals, what you want to pursue, your passions, but it might be diminished by your peers or the public or your family members in the worst case scenarios as being trivial
Right.
and not important. And conforming to perhaps what we may call social norms and social expectations. Does that divide make us unhappy? And I think you're absolutely right. One might argue, isn't inner peace something that is entirely personal? I mean, shouldn't that be more internal than anything else? So should we be torn apart by society, or should I have more willpower to stick to
Yeah,
my
exactly.
passions? Korean society can be described in a number of different ways, but if there is kind of something that we can work on, it is also hierarchical and rigid. Now, whether that is the most efficient way to run a society and a company, it's being questioned, right? I mean, some more progressive companies, especially in the tech sector, they try to do without titles, for example, right? They just use, in some cases, English names for some odd
Right, right,
reason.
right,
But,
right.
that's kind of to destroy that standing hierarchy or this structure in a conglomerate system. People are still, however, expected in various social norms to read the room, so to speak, and have 눈치 before
Yeah.
engaging in any corporate interactions. Where do you think these tendencies originate from? Because I've seen several opinion pieces on it just being deeply rooted in Korean history.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly does have something to do with Korean identity as a homogeneous nation, also from its cultural heritage, maybe also some Confucian tradition. I do think there is some of that. I'm not a historian, but regardless of where it comes from, I think it's something that seems to be just learned
Mm.
in society. And some people might say or argue, and I know I've seen these opinion pieces, if not books, say that this kind of nunchi is a tool to solve everything, a magic tool. But if anything, I think it's a tool to suppress the weak,
Mm.
and suppress thoughts and productivity, especially in the modern era.
Mm.
If you go to school, when I went to university, nunchi means you don't put your hand up to ask a question or you don't
Mm.
confront your professor.
Mm.
It means when you're in the workplace, you don't you raise your hand during meetings.
Mm.
It's the reason why you don't go home early because your boss is still in the office. I think nunchi, it kind of justifies and reproduces these unequal structures in society that have been passed down for generations.
Mm.
And it's a means of maintaining the status quo. And coming back to the idea of happiness or unhappiness, I think it reinforces or it maintains a lot of people's inner anger,
Mm.
which eventually makes them unhappy.
If we could only speak our minds and be respected for it. There is a complete inverse to that. I grew up in the state of California, and we're almost at the polar opposite end of this conversation. We're encouraged to share our opinions, perhaps a little bit too frequently. And sometimes that's not conducive to efficiency either. So we're not saying one or the other is completely better, but if in fact there is a correlational relationship between how South Koreans may feel unhappy, increasingly so, and this idea of nunchi and social structures in the companies, maybe we need to tear it apart and see if we can rectify the problem. There is increased polarization, it seems, in every part of the world. We talk about it
Yeah.
every day, but South Korea is not immune to it. Absolutely not. We talk about the gender gap, the age gap, the political gap, and that's only the beginning of a very long list. What do you think, Rafael, is fueling this very concerning phenomenon in South Korea?
If I could just answer that question is one simple word, I would say inequality. Inequality in society that has always been here. I mean, it's always been around us. And by the way, this is not, like you said, not unique to South Korea. But inequality has always been around, but it's never necessarily been resolved. And now we live in the 21st century. Young people are not blind. They know, they are aware of themselves, their existence, their rights, and are asking questions, and rightly so. And I think it's reaching a bubbling point at the moment, where we have so many grievances in society and so many inequalities, but not necessarily much will, or say even political will, to resolve any of these issues, if not try to maintain them.
In the political realm, I think that's an entirely different objective, maybe. Sometimes it helps politicians to win votes by further polarizing societies, right? And that's just unique to the political sector. But you're absolutely right. If there is a problem there, a fundamental one, it should be in the interest of politicians in trying to rectify a polarized society. Every time we elect a new president, they promise to unite the country, and
They do
that,
the opposite.
right, and that noble pursuit is tough, but it is a noble one after all. I think in your book you bring up really interesting points about the role of Korean politics and Korean media having played a big role in inflaming the country's growing social divide. So could you perhaps elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, like I just said, people have a lot of grievances, maybe due to these structural or societal inequalities that have been going on for so long. And then these grievances, or these people's weaknesses, like you said, are exploited or even weaponized by politicians who blame the other side for their grievances. I mean, and then they put the two together, and then they appeal to a certain audience and say, I am the person who will fight against this. And certainly these people might have issues, but I think the blame is directed towards the wrong people, or the wrong crowd. And I think we saw that was very evident in the previous presidential election, where a lot of young disenfranchised men were appealed in a certain way, and the blame was like, okay, well, the blame's on the women and on the feminists. I mean, that's an entire different issue, but then now that we're in the new administration, then we kind of ask the question, okay, well, now that you got the votes and now that you got the people, what are you going to do? Now that you got the support, what are you going to do about it? And now those people who voted seem to be a bit lost, and maybe might even regret having made certain choices, because there aren't necessarily solutions, especially when the blame was wrongly shifted in one direction to the other. And it's not just politicians, it's media also who are using this kind of rhetoric, especially to, in such a saturated media environment, where every person can become a media these days, and is vying for clicks. And so if you want to make clicks, you want to make it as sensational as possible. And so a lot of the time you'll see just outrageous, headlines, copy pasting certain things in the headlines, and I think that also definitely kind of fuels the divide, because we all look to the media to get our opinions in a way.
Actually, in my intro for this entire show, I've talked about a modern art piece by Mel Bachner, and it's just this big bold letters. All it says is on this canvas is blah blah blah, and and what this artist wanted to convey, kind of humorously, was that there's way too much noise in the media and sensationalized stories. And I'm glad that we're talking about it, because I do believe our listeners are a little bit more well educated. We keep bringing it to the forefront that you should question sources, you shouldn't question incentives. I think that's a good place to start. I mean, information is not limited and restricted to extents of where it was in history. So we can be, I think, smarter citizens, which brings me to my last question of the day. Do you think there are systematic changes that are needed, or that are within reach, to maybe rectify some of these issues that we talked about today?
$1 million question. And I think, something that every, politician or president would want to know themselves. But I think it comes down, usually my answer for many questions is it comes down to education. I think it's important to educate people that difference is what makes us, diversity is what makes us, instead of tearing ourselves apart and being so divided. I think it's important to understand that diversity does exist, it can exist, and it can coexist in Korean society, and that you can be different. Who is normal in this society, if that makes any sense. I think we should be asking these bigger questions, maybe at school, for example. But yeah, coming back to the politics, I think we should be focusing, politicians should be focusing on, they say it, bringing people together, but we see every day, especially in the past few weeks, in Korean politics, we've seen it's just a blame game from one side to the other. It doesn't even matter what you believe in. It's just saying the opposite of what the other party says. So I think, these politicians represent society, and I think it's important that they too should, be reasonable. And again, media as well, I think, should be less sensational and focus on the things that matter rather than the things that divide us.
Rafael, honestly, I gave you the $1 million question that is tough for even lawmakers to answer. I do apologize, but you are the one that are asking the tough questions. So I got to ask the expert. This was a delightful conversation. Thank you, and congratulations on the publication of your latest book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.